This is our penultimate class, and welcome to everybody who's here. Kate has put the handout in chat because it doesn't seem to have arrived with everyone. It was due, those who have received it in an email a couple of hours ago. But if you didn't, it's available through chat through the Padlet. Kate, do you want to say anything about it? Let me just take the share off at the moment. Did you want to say anything about?
Just to reiterate to everyone, if you have a wish to have a link to the Padlet or to the videos or any other information, if you drop me a private message in the chat, give me your email, I will endeavour to give you as much as I can. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just noting something down before I lose it. Right. Right, so our penultimate class. Today we are looking at expansion and disintegration, which I have to say hasn't gone the way I expected when I started writing. I still think it works, but it didn't quite go the way I planned, mainly because I discovered more in disintegration than I expected. But what we did at the end of the last session was we looked at the Enlightenment, we looked at the Romanticism and the way in which they produced different kinds of movements. And we looked a little bit about the holiness movement in the United Kingdom, for example, and in the United States, and various parallel forms of it on the continent and so on. I don't want to start immediately from there and just carry on chronologically. I want to go back a stage and reconnect with what was happening earlier with the beginning of the mission movement. Now, this is not the place to do a detailed study of the history of missions. Largely, the history of missions comes under denominational history because each denominational stream has produced mission in its own way. So it kind of needs to be done that. Though when we get on to reflect on the ecumenical movement, fascinatingly, modern ecumenical movement grows out of the mission, the denominational missions. So we will look at that in our next session. But I want rather to note that once mission as a movement, as an understanding of going from one place to another very deliberately in order to plant churches, once that started, it grew very rapidly in a whole variety of forms and went to a variety of destinations. Now, mission theology is, here's just a, yeah, you can see what it is. It's a mission map. Mission theology is not, or history is not an unproblematic history. It's connected with empire. There's the lack of cultural honouring of the context in which people went, the importation of Western forms of faith and practice and sort of cultural worldview that didn't necessarily reflect gospel and actually reflect more to do with culture. There was the non-recognition of already existing indigenous churches, and yeah, this is definitely one of the contested parts. Does it or does it not work in parallel with imperial government? Because of course, if you're taking just from the British point of view, the East India Company, which is the forerunner and the prototype really of the Raj in India, resisted missions and kept the missionaries out. And so British missionaries who went to India while the East India Company were in control actually had to go through, mainly through Denmark. They weren't allowed to go in to parts of the country where the East India Company were in power. So the link with empire is not necessarily absolutely straightforward, but there is a link, and that there are issues there that need to be unpacked. Saying that, there are positives. There's the provision of education in a variety of places, particularly education for girls, in a context where that had not been important culturally. There's the provision of medical aid and, more importantly, medical training. There's the challenge to imperial rhetoric, which does emerge out of some of the missions, and particularly with the Jamaica mission and the anti-slavery movement that arises as part of that. So it is a contested history, and there's a lot of complexity to be uncovered in it, which is one of the reasons I don't really want to spend too much time on it tonight, because it's too complicated to try and do in the time that I've got. But it is certainly a significant history, because amongst other things, what it does is expand the whole sense of church. And we're going to reach back to where we were talking about medieval notions of Christendom, basically covers Europe. Because basically that's the bit of the world that people knew. They knew there was a Here Be Dragons area out to the east, and basically that was Turkish, which at that stage meant Islamic. But of course, what we now know of the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, just weren't known. So there was no sense of the church there. And basically, east and south of Europe wasn't really thought of as being part of Christendom. Of course, now the global south is where the church is at its strongest and is growing. And the growth of that, or the impetus towards recognising that and becoming part of that, comes out of the mission movement. So there is an important part of our contemporary experience of church that has its roots in the way in which the mission movement opens up the sense of where the church is, what the church might be, the cultures in which the church might exist. And it begins in the 1792 is the beginning of Baptist missionary societies, the first of the denominational mission societies from our part of the world, and it grows very rapidly from then on. As well as mission overseas, one of the things that home mission, sorry, this is just reflecting on the slavery mission, the link between anti-slavery mission. William Knibb was a missionary in Jamaica, and who came home determined to change things, determined to resist slavery and to challenge its hold. Sam Sharp was a freed slave from the States who went to Jamaica. He was a preacher, he was a church leader, and he founded churches that were black-led churches in Jamaica at about the same time as William Knibb and his compatriots were coming from Britain. And Sharp was involved in the anti-slavery rebellion, which is known as the Baptist War, because so many of the Baptist congregations were involved in trying to overthrow slavery. It led to some very horrific executions as a result. But it was, in a sense, it was part of that whole process which led to the abolition of slavery. Sorry, that bit got overlooked in my note-taking. But for the Western Church, mission overseas prompted the recognition of the need for mission at home. Again, go back to the medieval, the early modern period, there was no need for mission at home because everybody, except for Jews and a few other exotic folk, were part of the Christian community. But the major change in through the 16th and 17th century, and then the philosophical developments that we were skimming through last time, made it very clear this could no longer be assumed. And the early revivals, which take place, which shape, we talked a little bit about as we come onto the Romantic movement, they were about calling lukewarm believers, so people who were already part of the Christian community, to a living and active and serious faith. And that was very much part of the growth of the understanding of mission in the sort of the 18th and coming on to the 19th century. And slides have jammed now. There we go. William Law, for example, wrote a book called A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And what he's arguing for in this is not a move from unfaith to faith, but to becoming active in a faith that was already shared. You were already part of the faith community, but the call in this and the preaching that grows out of it was to live this with faithfulness, to take seriously the baptismal vows that had been made on your behalf, to live them out, to take the faith seriously as a day-to-day thing, not just as tending into service. This is a hugely influential book. It influenced Wilberforce, for example. He traced his commitment to the ending of slavery in part back to reading A Call to a Devout and Holy Life, because that had prompted him into a kind of theology and religious experience that was to do with active discipleship. and it had a huge impact on evangelical piety. But the evangelical revival itself changed things, because one of the things about the revival is it sets up a border. There's now a need to discern between differences between those who believed and those who didn't, at least for the evangelicals to make that distinction. And I've put on the second of the handout sheets, which is only 3 or 4, I think it was. I forgot to put resources at the end of the handout, so it went out as 2 separate sheets. But I think if you want to understand the history of evangelicalism, or evangelicalism as a historical phenomenon rather than a theological strand, absolutely the book to read is David Bebbington's book, Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, 1730s, I think, to 1980s. It is the seminal work. And one of the things that this book does is define evangelicalism historically in a descriptive way rather than a prescriptive way. So it's not evangelicals are those who do this, this, and this, or who believe that, that, and that. And what Bebbington does is he comes up with what he calls the quadrilateral, and what the rest of us call the Bebbington quadrilateral, and you'll find it referred to that now in the literature. And the evangelicals historically are marked by 4 aspects: the biblicist, crucicentrist, conversionist, and activist. So they take the Bible very seriously. They are committed to a doctrine, usually of substitutionary atonement, but certainly the centrality of the crucifixion rather than the incarnation. There is a contrast there with other forms of churchmanship at that point. Sorry, I did biblicist and crucicentric, didn't I? Conversionist, so there's an expectation of a change of life. And activist. Evangelicals, from the early part of the evangelical revival up until, and we'll come to it towards the end of today's section, but up until the beginning of the 20th century, absolutely committed to changing the world. And Wilberforce is an absolute example of that. You know, the whole point of this faith is to change the world. That changes when we get into the 20th century. But those 4 aspects Bebbington has outlined, and I say it's now known as the Bebbington quadrilateral, and becomes a way of defining the movement historically rather than theologically, which is remarkably helpful if you're doing church history. One of the things that happens with the evangelical revival is splits, divisions within denominations. So you get within the Anglican Communion, for example, the split between evangelical and broad church, and then later on high church. You get within Methodism certain splits, and then actually breaking off and into divisions into different groups. In 1846, the Evangelical Alliance was formed, and the point of that was to bring evangelicals together over denominational lines, or disregarding denominational lines. And it's the first of several such movements, associations or societies, or whatever they call themselves, that come together over something, evangelicalism or other kinds of theology, and cross denominational lines. And that's why I've sort of talked in this session about disintegration. There are splits and divisions happening within denominational communities because it's as if there's sort of centrifugal forces pulling as well, but other things that people are identifying with. So they will stay Anglican or Baptist or Methodist or what have you, but they will also be defining themselves as evangelical or broad church or liberal or what have you. And so this whole sort of movement gets split up and divided. I have no idea what's coming up there. Yes, I have. This is quite a shift. We talked about, or I talked, and you had to listen, about the growth of denominations as being one of the Enlightenment, one of the things that happens in Enlightenment, the possibility of living with difference. But the denominational identities begin to break down. They break down much more rapidly in the 20th century, but begin to break down with the evangelical revival, but also the other kinds of theologies that are coming out at this point. So you move from the medieval period through the Reformation from one church to many churches. You're now moving into the era of denominations, and if you want to use the modern term, networks which cover over that. So you get divisions within denominations. So you get another breakdown, in a sense, of what it is to be one church. For the Anglicans, for example, the big divisions are between evangelicals and the Oxford movement. In other denominations, you get other kinds of splits. It even happens with the Roman Catholics. There's a major division begins to happen for the Roman Catholics. Now, all of the Western movements are facing the challenge of what they call modernity, all the denominations. And this is the sort of philosophical shift, if you like, on from the Enlightenment. For the purpose of our reflection, I'm going to concentrate on modernity as kind of philosophical and cultural movement, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, the impact that it has on society with the division of labour, the growth of cities away from rural, people moving from a rural life, from living in villages and small towns into the cities, the rapid growth of cities in the 19th century, and the intense poverty starts in the UK, but it has its impact as well. Industrial Revolution, not just the poverty, starts in the UK, has its impact in the States and in Europe. And of course, the political impact of that, and we can summarise that with the image of Marx. There's also, as part of that, the impact of what could call scientism. So it's the Enlightenment has this growth in terms of scientific understanding, which for Enlightenment thinkers is very positive. It's very hopeful. It's a strong belief in progress. We can make the world better. We can manipulate and make the world better. As we come on through the 19th century, it begins to lose some of that hopefulness. It means there are still a lot of people who are very hopeful about the way in which science is going to make the world better. But there are also those who get quite disturbed by it. And they disturbed by the impact that it's having on people. So the sense of loss, thinking specifically within the UK, the sense of loss of the rural community and the move to impersonal cities, which is driven by industrialization and the science behind all of that. And the loss of a sense of human control, and things beginning to feel inhuman or dehumanizing. And that we get that with some of Marxian thinking. And what you do is get people trying to make sense of that. So Marx is trying to make sense of what is happening economically and what is happening, or how to make it better for those who are suffering. That's his idea. You get Freud, who's also trying to make things better. He's trying to understand what's happening to people. What is the complexity of people? He starts to ask questions that people haven't asked before and come up with answers that people have really not come up with before. And I think in some ways, Freud's assumptions have become so much part of our culture that we forget just how startling and unnerving they were for people and how much resistance he provoked, not just amongst religious folk, although he does provoke a lot of resistance there. And theologically, they get a huge shift. And I'm just representing this with one person, a man called Ernest Renan, who starts to apply new techniques, as it were, new historical techniques and new techniques of literature to reading scripture and to reading church history, and begins to raise questions. And all sorts of other people are doing it, but he was kind of the notorious one at the time. And one of the things is that he particularly argues for is that modernity is about the resistance to tradition. It's about overturning tradition and discovering new ways of doing things. And for churches where, I mean, we embed it in our absolute liturgy, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. Tradition is right there every time we celebrate communion. To be told tradition is a bad thing and all this new and healthy and good comes out of modernity, you can see where tension's going to begin to grow and people are going to become very uncomfortable with it. The Enlightenment, modernity is a continuation of the Enlightenment project. It's about finding evidence. It's about believing in external and objective truth, which is discovered by inquiry and by investigation, not by taking things on authority, but by exploration. And truth is truth when it can be proved, and the kind of thing we were talking about last week. It's also a continuation of the Romantic project, the importance of the inner state. So Freud very much it comes out of that Romantic tradition of what is really important is what is inside me and how that is expressed and explored and how I understand it and get to grips with it. And within churches, it comes out in terms of it's about conscience alone. It's not about authority. It's about what do I feel, how do I experience God, and the guarantor of truth is my experience and what happens to me as a result of belief. Now we can see what we would now call culture wars emerging at this point. You can see how different traditions are clashing. Older and newer traditions will come into clash, and divisions, as I say, are growing in denominations. Divisions are growing in congregations, let alone denominations. Divisions were growing in missionary societies, particularly over attitudes to modernity. And what do you do with this new learning? What do you do with Marxist economics? What do you do with Freudian psychology? What do you do with the new kind of theology that's emerging? Do you accept it? Do you take it on board, or do you reject it absolutely? Now, the most dramatic reaction comes from the Roman Catholic Church with the Vatican Council in 1868. Now, this is the first full council of the Roman Catholic Church, called an ecumenical council, but of course it's not an ecumenical council now because it is only the Roman Catholics, and there's a vast amount of church that is no longer part of that. Okay, but in 1868, a council is called, and it's the first council since the Council of Trent, which laid out what we now know as the Catholic or Counter-Reformation. And the Vatican Council had actually, in the end, only achieved two of the aims that it had. Met in 1868 started for a series of sessions. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and the council stopped. It was never formally ended, but it had to stop because of that. But there were two things it did achieve. And its intention was, first of all, to counteract modernism, and also to define the nature of the papacy. And it had the normal type of committees and subcommittees and specialists and proposals. There were about 1,000 eligible to attend. There were about 700 actually present at the opening. Several came in later. But they managed to issue two, what they call constitutions, which are doctrinal statements, which cover the two issues that they wanted to address. Dei Filius, I've given you quotations from both of these on the handout. Dei Filius, which is a shortened definition of the content of the faith. It's kind of going back to the Council of Trent and reiterating it, but shaping it so that it deals with the issue of faith and reason. So this is absolutely about facing up to modernity. And it is a very conservative and a very authoritative statement, and it explicitly rejects the influence of modern theology. It wants to stick with, if you like, what had been agreed and not get involved in the contemporary debates. So Dei Filius is the Roman Catholic Church's pulling up the drawbridge, really, to shut out the impact of modernity and preserve the integrity of the faith as passed on. The second one, Pastor Aeternus, deals with the authority of the Pope. There were long and heated debate about this, but it actually leads in the end to the statement of papal infallibility. That is, that the Pope, when speaking as Pope, so not just in general terms, in general conversation, but in a very specific set of circumstances about issues of faith or morals, again, a very contained area, is infallible. Not because of any particular, how would you put it, brain power of the individual who fills that office, but because the office itself is preserved by the Spirit. That's the argument. This is the papacy that holds infallibility, not the individual pope. Now, there was a huge debate about this, and there were those who resisted it, and for all sorts of reasons, but it was eventually passed. One of the things it did was lead to the formation of what were called the Old Catholics. Now, they'd actually existed before. They'd already separated from the mainstream of Roman Catholicism over the issue of the authority of the papacy. But this formal statement of infallibility meant that some who had kind of knew they were there but didn't pay much attention to them actively went and joined. Old Catholics still exist, and they've recently split again over issues to do with women in the priesthood and LGBTQ rights. So again, what we get here is an attempt at definition and about boundary and a disintegration, a separation. But for the vast majority of Roman Catholics, these two statements, and this is a truncated council, it would have gone on and debated other things and made other pronouncements, but because of the Franco-Prussian War, wasn't able to. But these two statements define the church right up until till we get to Vatican II in the 1960s. So, and it's very much an anti-modernist position and an authoritarian position. And that becomes the persona, if you like, that the Roman Catholic Church presents. So the Vatican Council, now known as Vatican I, but of course at the time just known as the Vatican Council, defined and shaped the Roman Catholic Church the next century, and it drew people into it for exactly this reason, as a resistance to modernity in all its forms. So it's resisting modernity not just theologically, it was resisting modernity artistically, so refusing certain kinds of music, certain kinds of art. And this is one of those things you sort of know with different bits of your brain. I was leading, we do reflections on art sometimes as a Bible study, particularly in Lent and Advent at church. And we were looking at what I thought was a very moving modern representation of the crucifixion that had been put up in a Roman Catholic Church in the I think it was late 1940s, early 1950s. And part of the background notes on this was about the horror and the anger and the distress that people had expressed. It was not because this was not Christian art. And it led to a fascinating discussion with my Bible study group. But actually what we were realised afterwards, what we were encountering there was the effects of Vatican I, because this was a modernist presentation, and Vatican I had said this could not be Christian. So it was to be thrown out. So in a sense, all the discussion we were having had nothing to do with what the actual debate had been. So there was the rejection of modern art. There's also rejection of politics, of modern politics, including democracy. That democracy was seen, and it grew out of Enlightenment, it grew out of the changing political thinking that we saw reflected in our last session. And the Church very much wanted to resist that as dangerous. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is not alone in this. The 1832 Great Reform Act in England, which in the UK, which extended the franchise, was resisted by the bishops because it was a modernist production. It was dangerous. It was allowing the wrong people to speak. So this rejection of democracy is part of the general church's resistance to modernism and modernity. I've looked at the Vatican Council because it was such a big event and so formal and did its thing in a way so publicly. But there were similar splits in most denominations and traditions. And we can characterise it really as, and it was characterised at the time, as a division between liberal and conservative theologies, between a liberal theology as one that would embrace modernity and a conservative theology as one that would reject modernity. And the best known example of where this came up was to do with Darwin and the theory of evolution. Now, again, this is not a straightforward story. Many conservatives, or those who were assumed to be conservative, were actually quite at home with the idea of evolution as a process. You can see hints of it in Augustine. So you can find, Augustine didn't have the biology for it, but he does talk about the way in which God at work is changing things and things are moving on. And there are stories of churches going on trips to go and look at fossils and attending lectures on the subject of Darwinism and evolution and all that's being discovered in the 19th century with the rise of geology and the exploration of fossils and all the rest of it. But there is no doubt that Darwinism and other scientific discoveries did challenge assumptions that people within churches had just taken for granted. Just, for example, what the scripture seems to say about the age of the earth, or the nature of the creation process, or indeed the meaning of the creation story. and the place of humanity as, well, is humanity part of just an ongoing process, or is humanity the crown of an intentional crown of creation? The push into conflict between evolution on one side and traditional theology on the other side comes from both sides. Not so much from Darwin himself, but from a man called Thomas Huxley, and he got into public debate with the Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, and he was very good at spin, and he gave the impression that church thinkers had not grasped the issues. And again, I've put some quotations on the handout for you. Huxley is a very good spin doctor, and was able to represent the church as simply not understanding and not trying to understand the issues, and just pulling up the drawbridge and rejecting it all without considering it. And this, I have to say, was reinforced. We wander a bit further forward. It was reinforced in 1925 when there was a move to ban the teaching of evolution in science classes in 15 of the states of the United States of America. And some Methodists organised for a teacher to defy that ban in order to force a trial. And it was the Scopes case, becomes known as the monkey trial. I think I put a couple of cartoons actually on the handout for it. The court was very biased in favour of the non-evolution position, but the person on the witness stand to defend the theological position was just pulled apart and out-argued, and Scopes was convicted, but the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned it, and it all gradually died away, and it was all a bit of a mess. But the whole point had been to try and drive a wedge between believers and scientists, and it succeeded in doing that. And this whole question of the relationship between science and religion has remained a complicated one, a difficult one, and a battleground. And, you know, we're living with it. We're living right in the middle of it in certain places at the moment. But it had its impact on liberal theology and on conservative theology, and kind of drew some, the biblical word shibboleth is a perfect example here. You know, what position you take on certain things indicates what position you take on other things, and science is one of those things, one of those areas, evolution. The divisions continue to harden and to culture wars is a relatively new term, but I think a lot of this we can identify as kind of as culture wars. Papal infallibility for Roman Catholicism was one reaction. For non-Catholics, another reaction between 1905 and 1910 was the birth of, amongst evangelicals, what was called the fundamentals or fundamentalism. And what we now refer to, oh, there's the Scopes trial, I knew I'd put it up somewhere. There we are. That's cartoons from the local paper at the time of the Scopes trial. What we now refer to as fundamentalism often presents itself as a preservation of the old ways against all this oncoming tide of modernism. That, I want to suggest, is not an accurate representation. In fact, though fundamentalism is trying to resist modernity, it's actually a very clear example of a modernist approach. In 1895, there was a Bible conference in Niagara, and again, there's a little cartoon about it there. And this conference defined what they believed to be the fundamentals of faith. And those were the inerrancy of Scripture, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement, and the bodily second coming of Christ. And there are a series of affirmations that sound familiar, and yet different. I mean, those have come up all the way through church history. Issues like the nature of Christ have been discussed from, well, Paul's talking about it in letters, and it's the whole Arian controversy. It's debated in the medieval period. It's always being discussed. Here, the emphasis is on the deity, because the wider emphasis theologically at this period was on the humanity of Christ, particularly an academic discipline known as the quest for the historical Jesus. Now, this is a product of the late Enlightenment, a way of reading texts and searching for their history and what's behind them. So reading fairy tales, what lies behind the fairy tales? Where do they come from? Why do they take that shape? Also, let's do the same with the Bible then. So what lies behind the Gospels? What is the historical root and context? And one of the things that becomes very popular is the writing of biographies of Jesus, of harmonizing the gospel history and trying to smooth out the differences. And, you will know that the chronology of the gospels is different, particularly the differences between the synoptic gospels and John. So trying to smooth that out and say, well, were there two events if they're referred to in different ways, or is it just one event? How do we put together a coherent biography rather than whatever it is the Gospels are? By the late 19th century, this is a very popular genre of writing amongst Christians. Now, it varies in quality and it varies in theology. It varies from the very pious, very sentimental, through to what we would now call completely demythologizing. But what it usually does is reflect the pre-existing vision of who Jesus is, often Jesus as a teacher or an example, sometimes as a hero, very often far removed from first century Judaism. A pious Englishman, actually, in some of them. The first of the ones to be written was written by a man called David Strauss, 1835, not unexpectedly called Life of Jesus. Ernest Renan, who I was talking about earlier on, probably wrote what is probably the most popular of Life of Jesus. His came out in 1863, and the presentation he gives of Jesus is of a Jesus who is radicalized by the opposition that he encounters in Jerusalem. So he's this popular teacher, grassroots, all the rest of it, rising, and then confronts the hierarchies in Jerusalem, and that's when he becomes radicalized, and that's what leads to his crucifixion. It's actually a very anti-Jewish form of Jesus, because it's when he comes up against organized Judaism. It kind of ignores the Judaism that would have been part of his life in Nazareth and as he moved around Capernaum and so on. Other books emphasized Jesus' eschatological views. Others, as I say, were highly sentimental, and it really was gentle Jesus, meek and mild. They culminated in Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer lived from... No, I haven't. Albert Schweitzer lived from 1875 to 1965. But in 1906, he wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. He, in a sense, is the one who coins this phrase. And what he does is give an account of the history of these books and the way in which people have worked at them. But he challenges them. He challenges the subjectivity of the book and insists, actually, the only way we can understand Jesus is in terms of Jesus' own sense of eschatology, that Jesus believed the end of the world was coming and that he was mistaken in that. Schweitzer argues that Jesus believed that his crucifixion would be the turning of the ages and would be the point at which the intervention, which he referred to as the coming of the kingdom, would happen. And he was wrong, says Schweitzer. That didn't happen, and so we have to then make sense of it. Now, that's the context in which this insistence on the deity of Jesus is being laid down as one of the fundamentals. People have been doing all this work on who is Jesus the man, and the Niagara Conference is saying we have to insist on the divinity of Jesus. There are also insisting on substitutionary atonement, and you say we've talked about a variety of doctrines of atonement. The insistence here is there's only one. On all the others are to be rejected. The only way of understanding the cross is in terms of substitutionary atonement. And then the one that's new, in a sense, is their insistence on the inerrancy of Scripture. And of course, they bring that one in first. Inerrancy is a very clear and technical term. It means, and it does get defined away by 1,000 cuts, because it starts off being we insist on the inerrancy of Scripture, and then it's the inerrancy of Scripture as originally given. And of course, we don't have the original manuscripts, and that's how you account for the mistakes and errors and contradictions. But the inerrancy of Scripture coming before everything else. And that's a new thing. And it's not that there hadn't been a discussion about inspiration, but this definition of inerrancy is a modernist position. It's insisting there is one and only one meaning, whereas for classical theologians, for medieval theologians, the whole point about Scripture is there are multiple meanings and you need to explore them, and you read allegorically and you read anagogically, so you read for the sort of parables and all the allegories in the story, and anagogical is about what's the moral meaning in this. Let's not worry too much about the history of it. What's the moral meaning in this story? All of that's going on. For this group, of the movement that it spawns, there is one meaning. It cannot be discussed. There is only one meaning. Now, that is absolutely, I say, a modernist position. The idea is you read it off like a textbook. A scientific assumption, there is one version of truth. Here it is presented to you. You can't discuss, debate, or anything. You know, 1 and 1 is 2 is obvious. Therefore, this is literally true. That is all there is to say about it. Now, that is a new position. And it's the one that underlies fundamentalism. This conference was followed by a series of pamphlets from 1905 to 1915. They were posted out, they were distributed, they were sent out free of charge to those who were believed to be influential in the churches. And they formed a common set of beliefs. They were based around these affirmations from the conference, but they sort of developed them. And again, what they do is divide denominations, because you get those within the whole range of denominations, some of whom accept this fundamentalist position, others of whom don't, but they all remain within the denominations. And so that's where the struggles are happening, and we're still dealing with it. We're still fighting with that. In the States, the issue of evolution was central, less so in the UK for reasons that I don't know enough about to be able to say, but it's clear it's much less of an issue. I mean, it's not that it's not an issue, but it's much less of a shibboleth issue in the UK. But as we move through the 19th and the early 20th, so I'm just checking the time here, the 19th and the early 20th century, we have the spread of missions, we have the growth and the self-confidence of the denominations, and we have the splits across them. We see it with the formation of the Evangelical Alliance in 1846. In 1898, you get the formation of what's first of all called the Churchmen's Union for the Advance of Liberal Religious Thought, which then becomes the Modern Churchmen's Union, which is now known as Modern Church. And that's, if you like, that's it's an Anglican movement, but specifically to bring together those who are committed to a liberal and modern theology. And in a sense, it's the counterweight to something like the Evangelical Alliance. And the debates are continuing. And for us, nowadays, it's much less likely to be over evolution. Nowadays, it will be over sexuality. And how do we, and it's the same debate. Because all of it is a debate about how you read Scripture and what you do with Scripture, and how you interact with Scripture and with the sense of, do you read it as a modernist text with one and one only meaning, or do you read it as a much bigger, broader, wider text, which is in a sense more slippery and less easy to define? Another place where this split shows is in the engagement or otherwise with politics. And here there is a significant, in the UK, there's a significant division between nonconformists and the Church of England. For much of the 19th century, that's a debate over establishment and whether the church should or shouldn't have an established position in government. And that, you know, we still talk about that between Anglicans and nonconformists. It's still there, but it really was a very significant debate in the 19th century, and got quite heated at times. But it also gets, and of course was emphasised with the rise of the Oxford movement and their question about what does it mean to be what's national apostasy, what happens when the government starts to behave in ways that actually undermine the church, which is what they saw happening, and where then is the authority of the church, and then the need to find another basis of authority. But it is also wider. In the late 19th century, you get the rise of what historians called, well, in fact, contemporary writers called, the nonconformist conscience. By the end of by the middle of the 19th century, roughly 50% of the population identified as nonconformist. So as belonging to Congregationalist Presbyterian, this is in England, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Quakers. Now that's a huge number. Oh, and Methodists. That's a huge proportion of the population, and was quite disturbing for the Anglican establishment at the time to discover that this amount of the population actually belonged to the chapels. On the whole, many of these folk were supporters of the Liberal Party, and that meant that they had quite a significant voice, and because they had this almost block voting, they had quite a significant voice when it came to political involvement, political engagement. At the end of the 19th century, the Liberal Party was led by Charles Parnell, and he was a known adulterer. And the nonconformist voice threatened that they would withdraw their support from a party led by somebody who was seen to be in breach of the commandments. This was one of the things that actually brought the nonconformist voice into focus. Can you bring a voice into focus? It was that sense of we have something to stand for here. We have something we need to speak about, something that is wrong politically that we need to speak about, and that sense of common purpose that emerged around that was also part of the anti-slavery movement, and the challenge to, I'm now using establishment not to mean church establishment, but what we would now call the establishment, the powers that be, the folk who are supported by and supportive of the status quo, who on the whole did not want to see slavery abolished. And the movement was nonconformist, but also involved many, especially evangelical Anglicans, to resist that and to argue for the abolishment of slavery. So the real political involvement in that involved boycotts of sugar from the West Indies. It involved campaigning, it involved leafleting, it involved protest marches, it involved writing to Parliament, all the kind of things we think of as political campaigning was involved in the anti-slavery campaigns. It was also going on for the nonconformists resisting establishment domination. On the whole, nonconformists who got involved in politics in the latter half of the 19th century were campaigning on, apart from anti-slavery, were campaigning on moral or social or ethical issues. Not economic on the whole, but on things to do with child labour, but to do with children education rather than the economic side of it. And the resistance to children being down the mines, which was one of the campaigns, was not, as we might like to think, to do with the loss of children. It was the fact that the children were down the mines and they were naked, and this was immoral. And that was the point at which the campaigning was going on. The temperance movement is important at this point, again, a nonconformist, largely led nonconformist movement. And the evils of drink and the damage that it did to family life, and the economic damage that it did to families. Father drinks away all the wage, the children starve, that kind of argument. So those kind of issues, arguing around or arguing for education. This becomes a really significant issue, but the beginnings of an argument around education, so that people can read scripture. That's and can be educated morally in order to live good lives. But the whole idea, the whole issue of education becomes a very significant one politically for nonconformists. The early 1800s, both Anglicans and dissenters, nonconformists, have formed societies to provide education. So there were schools provided by parish churches. There were also schools provided by an association that kind of brought together non-conformist churches, but they didn't have parish churches. They often didn't have enough. They were much smaller churches. They tended not to have the resources to, on the whole, I'm just thinking of one or two, to attach schools to a church, but in an area they could provide a school. And the assumption just wasn't questioned that religion would play a part in education. And so, of course, there were different inputs. If your parish church is running your school, then the parish priest will have a very significant part in it, and the religious teaching will be shaped around the liturgy and the use of, and the creed that is said each time in the liturgy and so on. If you're working with non-conformist churches, you're not working with a creed, you're probably not working with the same kind of parish system or priestly system. It's a different kind of teaching. And the idea was both insisted that what they were teaching was simply Christianity, but both were teaching with their particular favours and were resisting the other side. There were always more parish schools than there were non-conformist schools. It's just a fact of life. There were more parish churches. But by 1869, even with these schools, there were not enough places for all the children who needed educating. In 1870, government set up what they called school boards, which took on existing schools, and where there weren't enough schools to go, started new ones, which were funded by the rates. Now, the nonconformists were unhappy with this because of the Anglican dominance, and school boards which were elected tended to be real battlegrounds of theological, who was going to have the power, was going to be church or chapel. That's basically what was going on in that. But there was the option, and the idea was there would be one school in an area. If there was a church school, then the non-conformist schools would be closed down. And if there wasn't a church school, another school would be planted, but it would probably have an Anglican flavour. There was the option to withdraw from religious education if you were Roman Catholic, Jewish, non-conformist. But there's still, schools were shaped by an Anglican tradition. In 1902, there was another Education Act, and this Act made the provision for denominational schools, 80% of which were Anglican, to be funded publicly, to be run by the churches, but to be funded by public money. And this becomes something for the nonconformists. This becomes a no-no for the nonconformists. The phrase that at this point you've got the Oxford movement is becoming quite noticeable and is causing quite a lot of concern for nonconformists, and particularly because so many leaders eventually do become Roman Catholics, but it has a sense of Romanising the Anglican Church. And the phrase that was used of the 1902 Act was it was Rome on the rates. We were paying our rates and Roman theology was being brought in by the back door. And the nonconformists mobilised against this. There was rate strikes. I put up John Clifford there. John Clifford is a hero of mine. John Clifford was a Baptist minister, very much on the modern side, liberal theologian, embraced modern theology, trains as a scientist, fascinating guy. But one of the things he did was get very much involved in this argument. He was in court several times for it, and had his goods distrained because he wouldn't pay his rates because he was a minister in Paddington. By 1906, there had been 71,000 summonses for non-payment of rates. There had been 2,500 auctions of people's goods in order to pay rates, and 176 people had been jailed because of having sort of escalated to that point, all around this issue of the Education Act and the role of the churches within it. 1906, there was an election. There was a Liberal landslide, and largely the Liberals were elected by the nonconformists on the basis that they would repeal the 1902 Education Act and bring forward another act which would deal with these issues and make it, as far as they were concerned, a more equitable position. And they did try and introduce it, but it was defeated in the Lords, and it got tied up with Irish Home Rule and sort of debates around that, and it kind of disappeared. Now, there are various consequences of this that are just worth noting. Many or most nonconformists and evangelicals, and these are not necessarily the same thing, abandon politics at this point, withdraw from political activism. And many political activists withdraw from the churches. 1906 is the date at which the decline that those of us who are part of the 20th and 21st century church take for granted. That's when it starts. That's when you can, it's not absolute, it's not, it was all growth until then and it's all downhill afterwards, but the significant things happen in 1906. And one of them in the UK is around the Education Act, and that sense of abandonment, of failure, of politics is a mucky business, so we withdraw from that, or the churches have got so caught up in stuff that don't really matter, actually we should be concentrating on politics and making the world better, and leaving the churches behind. Now, the impact of the wars we'll talk about next week. There's all sorts of other things impact on the decline of the churches. But this withdrawal from politics in 1906 is hugely important, and it's hugely important in understanding nonconformist history and Anglican history as denominational histories, and also understanding evangelicalism, the way in which it develops. The Bebbington Quadrilateral has as one of its quadrants activism, and it stops at this point. It restarts, but it stops at this point. This is known as, historians know this as the Great Reversal. It's the reversal of involvement in politics. It's the move into disengagement. And it really doesn't start to change. This is a slow start in the 1960s, but it's really not until the mid-80s that you begin to get the kind of political engagement that I now like to think is around in many of our congregations. And at the same time, in the United States, let's move on this. Yeah. There are events going on that are still reverberating, and reverberating not just in the States, but in the world church. In 1900, barely a handful of believers spoke in terms of Pentecostal gifts being part of their faith and their expression of faith. By the end of the 20th century, 500 million people, that's a quarter of the Christian population, will identify as either Pentecostal or charismatic. So that's a huge, huge growth, especially at a time of decline. And Pentecostalism is usually marked as starting in 1906 in a revival in Azusa Street, in the Azusa Street Mission in Los Angeles. An African-American man called William Seymour, who's in the middle of that photograph at the bottom, was preaching at the Azusa Street Mission. And preaching a revival, the kind of thing that we were talking about with Charles Finney's revivals. There were methods you could employ in order to make revival happen, and something significant happened that was not what Seymour had been expecting. People started to travel in to Azusa Street. There were stories, there were experiences of people speaking in tongues, of healings, of visions, of praise and prayer meetings that went on way on into the small hours, despite the fact people kept trying to, the ushers kept trying to send people home. People wanted to stay because they wanted to stay and take part in what was happening. There's a huge holiness heritage in part of this. Many black-led American churches were very much shaped by the holiness theology and tradition. Now, there is a prehistory to this. Edward Irving, who was a Presbyterian minister in Scotland, who eventually moved to London, eventually drummed out the Presbyterian Church for preaching. There were various bits of his theology that were regarded as slightly off, but one of them was he preached an expectation of the Pentecostal gifts, particularly speaking in tongues. He eventually went on to found what was known as the Catholic Apostolic Church. The reason they had that name was when they were asked in one of the censuses, somebody was asked, what is the name of your church? And they, as everybody always wants to, it's a new movement, is, actually we're the real church. So they say we're the Catholic with one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Got written down in the census forms, Catholic Apostolic, and that was the name they took for a while. So the Catholic Apostolic Church, which never really became huge, but was around and made a bit of a noise, had this expectation of the preaching gifts. That's the early part of the 19th century. The holiness movement, so from the mid and on into the late part of the 19th century, had a teaching about second blessing. I was talking about it last time, that idea that conversion, but then sanctification. There was something beyond. There was a second blessing, a second movement. And that tied in with what Seymour was preaching and becomes identified in the movement that develops from Azusa Street with the gift of tongues. In 1905, in Wales, you have a revival, a spontaneous revival, not one that was preached, a spontaneous revival that broke out in various Welsh communities. And again, the huge impact culturally. But part of what emerged from that in the first few months was a movement where people felt themselves moved, compelled to pray for the gifts of power of the Spirit. And some of them went to visit Azusa Street and believed that what they saw happening there was the answer to the prayer that they'd been making. And so all of this begins to link up. This experience and this theology, which I think rises on the back of some of the existing theologies, and it spread very rapidly. There was an outbreak in Norway, where in Norway of speaking in tongues and of healings, and the church there was visited by a man called Alexander Boddy, who was the vicar in Sunderland, and he went and he was brought into this experience, and Sunderland became a really important centre of charismatic. He remains an Anglican. Charismatic phenomena and teaching, and I put on the handout a quotation from one of the brochures that was put out about the regular conferences that were held. And again, this is a feature of these kind of movements. People, so we talked a little bit about Keswick last time. Other conferences were emerging. People were coming together across denominational lines, drawn together by a particular kind of theology, in this instance, a Pentecostal and charismatic theology. And there would be a week's conference once or twice a year, and people would come together. There'd be specific teaching and specific expectations. So again, it raises the issues of boundaries. It challenges the issues of boundaries, particularly in England, within Anglican churches. How do you express this within an Anglican liturgy, within an Anglican structure? And that became a bit of a struggle in the 1920s. But there was also separation. But this is true in Wales. And begin to get actually new denominations emerging: the Apostolic Church, the Elim Alliance, the Assemblies of God, who all have different emphases and different structures. And actually, amongst those three, the differences was over the place of tongues. Was tongues necessary, or was it simply one of the gifts? When did it happen? What did it prove? Just to go back to look at the Azusa Street mission, it actually fell apart in the States over the issue of race. William Seymour was a black preacher. You can see there was one black woman there and amongst the leadership. Two. There were other black leaders, and there were white, particularly church leaders, who came to experience what was happening there, but then refused to be taught by black teachers. So the initial revival overcame the colour divisions, the race divisions that were so marked in the American church at this point, but they reasserted themselves, and the movement split. And some of the historians now will say that what happened in Azusa Street actually comes to an end. You could also argue it goes off in different directions, but it split over issues of race. But as a movement, Pentecostalism continues. Say it's the growing part of the church. The emphasis in the teaching on the gifts of the Spirit, on Adventism, the expectation of the second coming. Sometimes, but not always, fundamentalism. Usually conservative theology, but not always necessarily fundamentalism. And through the century, it has grown and spread rapidly, and we will touch on it again in our next session and the way in which it has grown and taken on different shapes. But there is a hidden history that often doesn't get talked about, I think, because in a sense, it's still too new to recognise in the impact of what comes out of Azusa Street and out of the Welsh Revival and out of Norway and then Sunderland, and the impact that that has had, not just in Western churches, but in global South, churches in the global South, and the growing churches. And book that I should have put on, I will make sure goes on the next handout, understanding some of this and the impact it's had. Harvey Cox's book, Fire from Heaven, a very good analysis of how this works. But oops, I obviously didn't put the whole thing. Just take this off. You just need to, we can read a lot of church history in terms of institution, and I think what I've been trying to say today is the institutions actually came under a lot of strain. Church continues, and faith continues, and people go on exploring it, but the institutions come under a lot of strain. I'm going to stop talking, and partly because I'm getting very... Sorry, it's not A New Heaven, it's Harvey Cox. I'll put it here. I will put the book I just mentioned. So it's Harvey Cox, Fire from Heaven. But I will add it, there we go. I will add it to the resources on the next handout because I'll be talking more about it than that. I have, as always, talked an awful lot. There is 5 whole minutes tonight if anybody wants to ask any questions or make comments. There's so much more I could have said. So there's probably stuff that you're saying, why didn't you mention? I've got you all into silence tonight.
Can I?
Hi.
The oud-katholieke kerk in the Netherlands, the Old Catholics, you mentioned that there had been a split over LHBTI matters. I'm not aware of that. I live in the Netherlands. The oud-katholieke kerk has my deep interest over tens of years.
Okay.
I wonder...
That was what I read on... there were a couple of things on social media saying there'd been a division. I don't know any of the details.
Well, not officially. It's a denomination of 5,000 members, and well,
in that case, I suspect what it's referring to is what's happening to almost all denominations at the moment. There is this discussion is going on.
There is discussion, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear it's not a split. That's really
no, not yet.
Thank you. That's encouraging. It's encouraging to those of us who are facing a split that it's not necessary. Thank you. There's a really interesting question. Andrea has raised the question that the Welsh Revival was such a huge impact. Why did it die out so quickly? How long have you got? There are various reasons put forward for that. One that I think is quite important to hear is that it got very focused on experience and there wasn't a lot of the kind of theological analysis and teaching that you see, for example, with the early evangelical revival with Jonathan Edwards or with Charles Wesley. And it kind of didn't have anywhere to go because it was all about feeling. There's a lot more to say about that, but that's one of the discussions. The other one, of course, is it gets caught up in that 1906 collapse that I talked about, because it's at roughly the same time. So it might have had, there was some impact of some of those who get involved in churches then find they actually have to choose between being involved in church and being involved in changing the world. And they actually go with, you might want to say, maybe they're not dying out, maybe they're working out their faith in a different way, but they find that their political commitment, there's no room for it in church. And so they become disillusioned. And it also might be we're getting to the end of the history of revivals is a whole other thing. It's the last of the major revivals. It might be it's the end of the revivals. That it's just becoming culturally unsupportable. Yeah, I went to a conference on it in 2005. I have a whole lot of stuff on that. I have to say, I came away from it thinking, I'm not sure I could cope with living through a revival. It just sounds so overwhelming. And that's the thing about the cultural changes. As the social changes are such that that level of emotional intensity with people you don't know, I think means something different in our kind of context, and I think may have an impact on why it faded away. Yeah, you're nodding. I'm encouraged, Andrew. I can see you nodding. Thank you. At least I've made some sense. Okay. Anybody else? Then we meet again in a fortnight. That will be our last session. In which case I will then cover everything I haven't said yet. I won't actually, but we will talk a little bit about some of the events in the 20th century, and what I'm hoping to do, but I'm not promising, is that I will talk a bit less, and there will be time for input because actually when we're getting into this, we're beginning to get into memories, and we've all got something different to contribute here and to teach people. But I'm not promising because I tend to talk too much. So thank you very much. Thank you for sticking through to the end. Those who endure to the end get rewarded. You remember, I have no idea what the reward is except getting to the end in this instance. But thank you for being here.